at university level in both a scientific discipline and theology, but John Weaver is one of these. He's born and brought up in Cardiff, and he did his BSc and doctorate in geology in the University of Wales, Swansea, and then taught at the University of Derby before training for the Baptist ministry in Oxford. And he's also been a pastor at Highfield Baptist Church, and then he taught at Regent's Park College in Oxford before going to be principal of South Wales Baptist College, and he's also on the staff of Cardiff Theology Department at the University of Cardiff. He's been president of the Baptist Union, and he is the chair of the John Ray Initiative. And his main research areas are relating faith to life and work, and doing the sort of theological reflection on that. And so lots of sort of synergies. And one piece of information not on the leaflet to give you an idea of his interests. I know he's chaplain to Cardiff City, I think it is, isn't it? So that shows how it brings many, many disciplines together. So thank you very much for coming to speak, John. And we look forward to hearing your talk.
Yes, with any good fortune, soon to be a premiership club. But there we are, we all live in hope. Thank you very much for the opportunity to explore yet another area that is on my heart. I really do enjoy theological reflection. I enjoy being able to look at different topics, and particularly to explore them with students. And so if we do that together, it'll probably be a good place to be. Oh, I need to press a button here. Oh, that's fine. That's just in case you get bored. Genetically modified plants have attracted a great deal of attention in the media in the last 20 years. But I think that it would be fair to say the public is largely unaware of the advantages and disadvantages of the technology. They probably know some of the sound bites, but not much more. From the very beginning, the two main areas of concern, of course, that have arisen, we've already heard of: the risk to the environment and the risk to human health. Although scientifically many of these objections have been shown to be unfounded. Although you might then question who was doing the analysis. Transgenic plants are those that have been genetically modified by using recombinant DNA technology. The technology is used in a number of ways, for example, to engineer resistance to abiotic stresses, such as drought, extreme temperature or salinity, and to biotic stresses, such as insects and pathogens, that would normally prove detrimental to plant growth and survival. Between 1997 and 2005, the area under GM crops has increased worldwide from 4.2 million acres to 222 million acres, a factor of 50 increase. Most GM crops are grown in North America, but there has also been a rapid growth in GM crops in developing countries. For example, in 2005, the largest increase in crop area planted to GM crops was soybeans in Brazil. Various health and environmental risks have been recognized or postulated, for example, on human health through allergic reactions and the effects on our immune systems. For the environment, there's been the effect on wildlife, the creation through cross-pollination of superweeds resistant to herbicides, and the loss of biodiversity. Celia Dean Drummond notes that such changes impinge not only on those people living in the countries where the plants are grown, but of course because they come to all of us through our global food supply. And it is highly unlikely that anybody in this room has not had GM soya, because it's probably been in a pickle or a sauce or a ready meal or something else like that. There's also added to this the patents taken out by biotechnology companies on GM seed, making access expensive and denying the use of this technology to those in the developing world. And that, of course, raises issues of justice. I'm a practical theologian, and what I want to do is to do some sort of assessment and analysis of the issues, then some identification of the ethical aspects, before considering a biblical and theological reflection, and that might lead us to some place where we can actually discuss, or at least have some sort of question as to what it is that we should be concerned about. If we look at GM crops, we can talk about the factors for and against. I mean, why do we produce GM crops? Well, some people might say that it's a matter of feeding the hungry. 840 million people are chronically undernourished, surviving on less than 2,000 kilocalories a day. Approximately 1.3 billion people live on less than $1 a day and don't have secure access to food. Many of these people are rural farmers in the developing countries, depending on their own small-scale farming and their own subsistence to actually make a living. Many can't afford the cost of irrigation, herbicides, pesticides, and that leads to a vicious circle of poor crop growth, falling yields, and susceptibility to pests. The world population, as we know, is growing exponentially. 6 billion in 2000, 7 billion in 2011, maybe 10 billion by 2050. And the largest proportion of the population is found in the developing countries. And so it's argued that GM crops might be one way of increasing food security. Possible improvement in global food security comes then through the techniques of GM crops. Crops can be made resistant to pests and diseases, so they need less insecticide, which is potentially less damaging to the environment. Crops can be modified so that they tolerate herbicides, making weed control easier. Crops then need less spraying. They may be safer for the farm workers. Now, that could be particularly valuable in developing countries. GM maize and cotton that produce a protein to kill insect pests are already grown in several countries. So that might be, again, another way forward. GM crops can be made to resist drought. Crop yields throughout the world are significantly reduced by the action of pathogens and parasites and herbivorous insects. And one of the main examples of GM crops in this particular area, the insect-resistant crops, would be those that have the Bt gene, the bacterium Bacillus thuringiensis. And that allows a crop to grow where the insects that would otherwise have been destroying it die as they try to eat it. Another commonly inserted gene, and in fact this is perhaps the majority of GM crops at the moment, have a resistance to artificial weed killers. Roundup is one of the major industrial weed killers that is used in agriculture, and soybean farmers have Roundup-ready plants. They represent about 3/4 of the genetically modified crops, and they have a gene that breaks down the chemical in the herbicide, so that the field can be sprayed to kill the weeds and leave the harvest untouched. Another form of genetic modification which people are very interested in is rice with added vitamin A, potatoes with more protein, fruit crops with reduced levels of allergens, low flatulence beans, and watermelons without seeds. Vitamin A deficiency is a particularly important area because it's estimated that vitamin A deficiency accounts for approximately 2 million child deaths per year in the developing world. And surviving children can be seen to have blindness that is caused by vitamin A deficiency. So therefore, golden rice, which engineers beta-carotene into the rice from which humans can synthesize vitamin A, becomes a very important technology. And the fact that this technology was provided free of charge to farmers in the poorest countries is an example of a health solution offered by plant biotechnology. Other GM plants can be used to produce plastics, new vaccines and drugs. And again, there are lots of advantages, both environmental advantages as well as advantages to people in the poorer world. But set against this are the potential risks. It's possible that genes from modified crops might escape into wild plants, protecting them from their natural pests or from weed killers. One fears that herbicide-resistant genes might get from the crop plants to their weedy relatives. And this could be a problem, particularly for such crops as oilseed rape and sugar beet in the British Isles, or sunflowers in the United States, which have got plenty of local relatives with which they could hybridize. Critics say that there's a risk of playing with the unknown in much of this technology. And yet, as James Watson points out, in the 1960s, pest control was mainly through chemical insecticides, which were poisoning the ground and poisoning the farmers. GM alternatives avoid such detrimental effects. It's also suggested that GM crops may disturb the natural ecosystem and harm wildlife, and pollinate organic crops, invalidating their organic status. Supporters, though, have observed that many of the risks that people associate with GM crops are more to do with good regulation than scientific uncertainties. Allergic reactions to GM crops are often cited, and the most frequently cited one is Brazil nuts, a Brazil nut protein put into soybeans. And of course, you will know that people can be allergic to nuts, and these particular soybeans have been found to be allergenic. There's also a danger that if you manufacture recombinant pharmaceuticals through plants, you run the danger of these entering the human food chain, so that we might be taking pharmaceuticals that we actually have no need of taking and might actually be detrimental to our health. It's also said, of course, that the intensification of agriculture, which has already changed, sometimes damages the environment. And yet, of course, agricultural intensification is something that is going to be the only solution to feeding an expanding world population. So we might note that agriculture will have to either become more productive or expand into new areas, which could be even more damaging to the environment. So, damage to the environment is something that is there anyway. The Soil Association believes that GM crops are making farming less fair, more risky, and no more sustainable. GM crops have locked farmers into further depending on costly inputs from a handful of powerful chemical companies, and have been sold it on false promises. Buy this and you will have that. Greenpeace observes that 10 corporations control nearly 70% of the world's seed market, and the Soil Association observed that 3 corporations, Monsanto, Syngenta and Bayer, are responsible for virtually all commercially released genetically modified crops in the world. This corporate control on agriculture means that farmers have very little choice. Now, whilst being cautious, we might, of course, accept that where GM crops are nutritionally and environmentally safe, they should be used. For example, the Chinese attitude is entirely pragmatic. With 23% of the world's population but only 7% of its arable land, China needs the increased yields and additional and added nutritional value of GM crops if it's going to feed its population. And with global warming leading to increasingly large areas of the Earth's surface subject to drought, there will be an ever-increasing emphasis on food security. Okay, but what's the ethics of this? How do we actually come to decisions? Well, we might start actually with perhaps the most important from a Christian point of view, is the issue of justice. There are aspects to such genetic engineering that are simply ethically unjust. In the 1930s, new hybrids of corn were produced, the seed of which was controlled by the companies that had produced the crop. There was further control that no longer could the producer use their own seed for the following year because the hybrid produces new unfavourable mixtures amongst its offspring. More recently, the new terminator technology has gone a step further in preventing engineered plants from setting seed and forcing farmers, therefore, to buy new seed every year. Up to 1.4 billion resource-poor farmers in the developing world depend on farm-saved seed and seeds exchanged with neighbours as their primary source of seeds. A technology that restricts farmer expertise in selecting seed and developing locally adopted strains is a threat to food security and to agricultural biodiversity, especially for the poor. And so what we're dealing here is really a sense of justice. With the patent announcement of some of the most important food crops, rice and wheat, staple crops for 3/4 of the world's poor, potentially these crops now enter the realm of a private monopoly controlled by those companies that have the patent. The United Nations at the moment has legislation that would not allow such restrictive patenting. So while GM crops are being grown in increasing amounts in more and more countries, there are bound to remain concerns over safeguarding the interests of the economically weaker nations and the biodiversity of the planet, while allowing the scientific progress to continue. But then, of course, alongside that sort of element of justice, we might talk about altruism. I mean, one of the most significant developments in GM agriculture in this last year or so has been with the John Innes Centre in Norwich. I was actually there last week and saw all the new, you can't call them greenhouses because they're plastic, but these huge areas for growing new potential cereal crops. A 6.4 million grant has been received from the Gates Foundation to allow the culture of producing corn and wheat and rice that don't need fertilizer. Now, one of the major costs in the developing world for farmers is fertilizer. And if you can produce a crop that doesn't need fertilizer, then you're going to enable a lot of resource-poor farmers to grow their crops. What they're trying to do is to engineer crops that can obtain nitrogen from the air in the same way as peas and beans do. Therefore, they don't need the chemical ammonia spread on the fields. If it's successful, it's hoped that this project will revolutionize agriculture, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is something that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is keen to do. So here is a technology that is being funded by an altruistic foundation that is wanting to enable the poor farmers in the developing world to be able to benefit from such technology. Serving the poor is maybe an area that we would want to think about quite a lot ethically, that actually it's very important that those of us who are well off should seek to share with those who are poor. In 2008, 850 million people were chronically hungry in the world, with 2 billion lacking food security. Consumption of food is now increasing faster than population growth because more people want to adopt the sort of lifestyle that you and I have. You can't blame them. The people in the developing world want a better lifestyle, and a better lifestyle means that there is a greater consumption of food, and particularly food of differing types. A major problem in terms of food security is the amount of land that there is to grow the food on. In 1961, the amount of cultivated land supporting food production was 0.44 hectares per capita. By today, so by 2013, it's about 0.26, so it's dropped from 0.44 to 0.26 hectares per person. And by 2050, it's likely to be down to 0.15 hectares per capita. And so the techniques that we're going to need to produce the crops that we already produce are going to have to change if we're going to see a crop yield sufficient to feed a growing population. And of course, and all the while, global climate change is also affecting what land there is. If you're going to talk ethically, you might sort of say, well, how do we do this? The Chinese are pragmatic. Maybe we're all pragmatic. Maybe consequentialism or utilitarianism is the way in which we approach the problem. Dean Drummond rightly observes that the secular philosophical basis for or against genetic engineering is entirely pragmatic, expressed through consequentialist philosophical framework, namely that says you judge the outcome by the risks. Is there more benefit or less benefit? Is there benefit or is there harm? The Roman Catholic Church has certainly interpreted genetic engineering in animals and plants from this perspective. Thus, GM crop production, which potentially increases food production in areas of the world where there are shortages, is good, clearly, from a consequentialist point of view. In addition, those genetic modifications that improve health, such as providing a source of vitamin A or vitamin D, are gratefully adopted, because that's good, isn't it? However, those who argue against GM crops don't simply urge us to understand the risks, which they think are underplayed. They also point to the self-deception involved, whereby we ignore the political and social causes of world poverty. See, the problem is, what we're doing is we're treating the symptoms rather than looking at the causes. And of course, that's because it's much easier for us in the rich West to look at the symptoms. Oh, let's find a technological fix. Let's not think about the injustice and the inequality that there is in the world.
Amen.
And then, of course, finally, there's the natural law argument. The argument that somehow what we're doing is we're usurping the role of the creator, we're playing God. And so people say, well, any form of genetic engineering is unnatural. It's against natural law. But you see, don't go down that road. There's a danger in that, because everything that we have ever done in producing food in the world has been done in this way. Everything that we have done over the past 2-4 millennia has been done through artificial breeding. Very few commercialized crops would be able to survive unaided in nature. So when considering natural food production, it should be recognized that technology has always played an important part in the food industry. So what about the Bible? What about theology? Well, Israel, in her worship, in her songs, expresses her deepest faith in God as her creator, sustainer, and redeemer. God, the God of Israel, is the God of the covenant. God is related to Israel as God's people and to the world as God's creation. In the Psalms, we have the theme of praising God as creator, almost as common as praising God as saviour. In Psalm 148, the whole of creation is called to praise God. In Psalm 65 and 104, the faithfulness of God in creation is expressed in worship. And of course, creation itself gives testimony to the goodness of God, as we find in Psalm 19. The fathers of the church, Justin Martyr, Theophilus of Antioch, Tatian, they all had a theology of creation, often elaborated in opposition to the prevailing Gnostic dualism that somehow separated God from the world, that God actually wasn't interested or involved. It affirmed the goodness of creation, created by God, and it never separated natural theology, what we actually see in the world around us, from an understanding of redemption in Christ. There's a lovely prayer here attributed to Basil the Great in the 4th century. I'll just read this for you. O God, enlarge within us the sense of fellowship with all living things, our brothers the animals, to whom thou gavest the earth as their home, in common with us. Think about the birds we've just seen. We remember with shame that in the past we have exercised the high dominion of man with ruthless cruelty, so that the voice of the earth, which should have gone up to thee in song, has been a groan of travail. May we realize that they live not for us alone, but for themselves and for thee, and they love the sweetness of life. Celtic spirituality has taken the same sort of line, and the modern revival of Celtic Christianity has again drawn us to this much greater understanding of God's immanence within creation. And of course also, if we're reading the Bible, we understand about being in covenant, God's covenant with creation, and our sharing that covenant with God, that the pre-fall picture was of our relationship with God, our relationship with each other, and our relationship with creation. And it was the fall that broke those relationships. So from a theological point of view, the human-centered model of control and exploitation of creation must be challenged. It's certainly challenged by our modern understanding of ecology, which recognizes that you and I are intimately involved with creation. We are challenged also by the recognition of the human impact that we are having, a human impact on the world which looks as if it's going to have irreversible and catastrophic changes to the environment. The decline in biodiversity affects the capacity of the earth to sustain human needs and reduces the resources of plant and animal species. The environment, therefore, becomes an aspect of justice. And when the environment is damaged, it's often the poor who suffer the most. You see, there are important questions for the Christian church about conservation, pollution, ecology, stewardship, and justice, as we try to find a theology for earthkeeping. We can ask whether GM technology is wrong, because it means playing God, in moving genes from one plant to another. We could argue, of course, that that's always been done in plant breeding or of closely related species. The difference today, of course, is that sometimes we're moving genes from organisms that aren't closely related. I mean, do we really need to have tomatoes that stay fresh longer? Do they have to have that nice red colour? And did you really want to have frog genes put in them to make it do that? Or at least that's what some of the research was suggesting. The Roman Catholic Church has drawn attention to the threat posed by the modern agro-industrial methods to many of the indigenous peoples of the world. And in considering biotechnology, the Roman Catholic Council looks at its use and acceptability from a moral standpoint and the possible consequences for human health and for its impact on the environment. However, they recognize an important theological truth, that nature is not a divine or sacred reality to be left alone, that somehow it must remain unchanged. The Catholic Church draws us to the important recognition that nature is a gift from God, entrusted to humanity for our responsible care. So they maintain that interventions that damage the environment deserve our condemnation, but that those that improve it are praiseworthy. And so we need to evaluate benefits and risks. Scientists are called to work intelligently at finding the best solutions to serious and urgent problems of feeding humanity and alleviating the problems of healthcare. But of course, say the Catholic Church, biotechnology entrepreneurs should consider the common good as well as their right to make legitimate profit. The key arguments from the Roman Catholic Church point to a concern over motives and justice and lifestyle and human benefit versus human harm. Well, at this point, I want to try and work through some sort of theological reflection. So I want to construct a diagram with you to explore the theological issues. Let's start with the observable data. Recombinant DNA technology is available. It is possible to develop crops with resistance to abiotic stresses, such as drought, high and low temperatures, increased salinity. It is possible to develop crops with resistance to biotic stresses, such as insects and pathogens. It is possible to develop crops with added vitamins. Now, if we follow the direct upward arrow in the diagram, that's the arrow of scientific materialism. It says we have the technology, therefore we're in a position to be able to provide a potential array of genetically modified crops. Well, that at least is the theory. But we note the misgivings of the Soil Association and Greenpeace that we should concentrate on practical innovations that are genuinely sustainable and not risky and promising more than they can actually deliver. So I would suggest that we can now see the relevance of considering the left-hand pathway on the diagram, where the observed data passes through the sharing of models and analogies, which evoke our understanding and help us to develop a response. This is the area of imagination and leaps of sympathy. And we're going to want to consider, amongst other things, the God-given creativity that human beings have, being created in the image of God. God has given us the ability to research, to develop. Then we might think about genetic modification and see that its analogy, if you want to find an analogy, the analogy is plant breeding. We need to hold in view the rapid growth in world population. We can't avoid that. We also can't avoid our concern over food security, particularly in the developing world. And so we might then say, as we're pulling together these models, that actually GM crops might be a way of saving lives by producing food in quantities and places where otherwise it would not be possible. Beyond this, we might want to explore the right-hand side of the diagram and consider the influence of beliefs in both the scientific and the religious communities. Some of the issues that we might identify is the fact that scientists often want moral guidance. We can, but should we? Then, of course, scientists will want to talk to us about the damage to the ecosystem and the damages to biodiversity. We could suggest that any manipulation of crops is playing God. And then, of course, we ought to be considering aspects of justice in food distribution and the availability of agrotechnology. And finally, we can consider the downward arrow in the diagram, testing a theory or practice through understanding persons and the world as a whole. First, that what makes a human being human is relationships. Our relationships with each other, our relationship with the whole created world, and our relationship with God. One must ask whether these relationships are at risk in the commercialization of food production. Certainly in some aspects of it, we might say. Second, scientific research on plants and animals cannot act in isolation, as environmental science is helping us to understand the holistic nature of the whole of creation. We are part of creation. So I want to try to come to a conclusion. How can we actually where can we ask the questions? Where can we find some answers? Which direction should we be pointing in? Well, with Dean Drummond, we can conclude that the Church is ambivalent towards all forms of genetic engineering, although the World Council of Churches has come to recognise that the global issues, particularly in the developing world, actually do need to be addressed by some form of scientific expediency. We can move the argument forward through a helpful discussion, I believe, of wisdom. And that's what I want to leave you with, is to talk about wisdom in the Bible. The observation of the natural world is not about seeking evidence for God's existence, but rather understanding something of God's creativity. Now, what about wisdom? How do we understand wisdom from a biblical perspective? Well, in the Bible, we find that wisdom comes in two forms. Look at the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs has got lots of lovely observations. You do this and that happens. You know, and that is common sense wisdom. That's the wisdom of science. That's the wisdom of observation and experiment. But then the book of Proverbs also tells us there is also lady wisdom. Lady wisdom that invites you to walk with her, to sup in her house, where you can actually learn what true wisdom is. What we're actually beginning to recognize is that there are two forms of wisdom. There is a God-given wisdom, which is what we have in our ability to experiment and observe. And there is the wisdom of God. And the two are not the same. The book of Job does exactly the same thing. In the book of Job, we find that there are two forms of wisdom. There is the sort of wisdom that Job has when Job talks about mining and talks about the rocks. As a geologist, I sort of go for this. Job 28. It's all about geology. And it's great. It's all observed stuff. But then when Job is trying to understand about suffering, how an innocent person can suffer, God says, you need my wisdom. And God takes Job on a walk through the garden and says, were you there when I did this? Were you there when I did this? Do you understand this? And of course Job has to admit that he doesn't understand. Because what Job is learning is that he has to be in tune with God. Paul Finney's hones this idea as he observes that in the Bible we find two kinds of wisdom. The observable factual wisdom based on experience and the senses, and lady wisdom who invites us to discover the deeper truths of the wisdom about God. The New Testament, of course, does exactly the same. In the Gospel according to John, in the prologue, chapter 1, and in Colossians chapter 1, we find the relationship between Christ and creation. And the Apostle John tells us that Jesus is the wisdom of God, the Logos, the Word, in the creation of the universe. John tells us that law comes through Moses, but truth, reality, wisdom comes through Jesus. Before his crucifixion, Jesus tells his disciples that he is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to the Father except through him. In effect, Jesus is saying that truth, the reality of God and of God's world, is discovered only through a relationship with Jesus, walking through life in his company. And he goes on to promise the disciples another counselor, the Spirit of wisdom and truth, who will be present with the disciples after Jesus has returned to heaven. We can discover a great deal through scientific observation and research, experiment and testing, and through our five senses: sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch. But there is still a sixth sense. There is the knowledge that comes through being attuned to God's wisdom, walking with God in God's world, living with Jesus, knowing the presence of the Holy Spirit, leading us into all truth, and understanding of reality and meaning of God's world, God's promises and God's purposes. We can ask, how far should we be allowed to become co-creators with God in engineering crops and animals for our own benefit? How far should we take transgenic experimentation? How do we distinguish one research project from another in terms of the likely risk and benefit for humanity and for the earth? I think that a theology of wisdom serves to unite the themes of creation and redemption by identifying Christ the Redeemer with the divine Logos, with wisdom, the wisdom of God involved in the creation of the world. Key to the argument is that wisdom recognizes the presence of God in the new technologies. There are key questions, though, to which we need the answers. Are we achieving God's purposes? Do we know what God intends? Are we excluding God from our discussions? As Phillips suggests, the answer is to be found by being attuned to God's wisdom. Ted Peters believes that our fear of genetic engineering is based on a false sense of genetic determinism, which Joe talked about earlier. He argues that giving humans more freedom doesn't take away from God's freedom. And if genetic engineering can be used for good, then it becomes a sin not to use it. But of course that raises immediately the ethical issues of what is good in the economy, politics, and production of food. Dean Drummond concludes that it would be naive to suggest that we can go back to an agrarian culture in ignorance of modern technology. However, she believes that too great a focus on human achievement and human freedom obscures the other theological principles, such as our mandate to care for the world. You see, technological manipulation of crops may not be good stewardship. And it may lead us to miss working for justice in the face of global inequality and poverty. And you see, that is so easy for us in the West to always look for a technological fix. We know this certainly when it comes to looking at global climate change. The support or rejection by theologians of genetic technologies will actually depend on our presumptions about anthropology. If we've got an optimistic anthropology, we see humans as co-creators, as God's agents of evolving, of progress. If we've got a pessimistic anthropology, we will see human sinfulness, which usurps God's place as creator. We have to conclude that wisdom, on the one hand, affirms the special dignity of the human race. Our abilities, our God-given wisdom. But the idea of wisdom as the agent of creation in the world shows us that it is cosmic in scope. Wisdom should encourage caution. The wisdom of God should encourage a caution for us in the way in which we act within the world. The book of Proverbs recommends that we walk with Lady Wisdom through the world in the company of others. And in the Christian context, the doctrine of the Trinity, we're encouraged to find the rhythms of giving and receiving in love. Relations which are wider and deeper than ourselves. Rhythms with which we can participate. I like Paul Phillips' idea of being drawn into the dance of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Participating in the very nature of God. Participating in the wisdom of God. This last perspective doesn't mean that we expect supernatural intervention. But we seek to cooperate with the gentle but effective flow of life, which doesn't overwhelm or replace human action, but which has a gift-like quality. The theological word is grace, which continually sustains the natural processes and promotes human flourishing. I think this is our guide. I'm not answering the questions. I'm just trying to find a pointer where we might go. Learning to listen to God, to walk with God in God's garden, to return to the initial relationships of creation, even paradise regained. But it is for us to be in tune with God's promises and God's purposes, to live attuned to the wisdom of God.
Thank you very much, John. Are there any questions?
Thank you very much for that kind of inspiring talk. And one thing I would like to suggest as well is perhaps we could redefine our definition of the poor in this modern day and age. that actually Africa, that we may call poor, or where I come from, we are exploited the most, supporting countries that say they are helping us in return. And for that I will cite out places like China. They export the most to our countries, which are farming countries, especially Uganda, but they don't import equally the same to their nations. How about if our trade, or if we stood up for justice, all of us, and said, China, as much as you export to Uganda, all these electronics, import the same in terms of food to feed your billions of people. And that way you're not treating them as poor people you need to give donations, but actually as equals with the same image of God and living together in harmony and in tune. So that was my suggestion.
Yes, thank you very much. I would agree wholly that the whole area of justice and fair trade, I mean, these are important issues, and they all knit together.
Thank you. John, you mentioned population growth a number of times and the consequent reduction in hectares of land. And I think at one point you said that the response to that has to be agricultural intensification of some kind or another, further agricultural intensification. And that seems to me a bit passive. If the issue is for a very small amount of money comparatively, all the unmet need for family planning in the world could be addressed. It's a tiny amount of money compared to the amount required for agricultural intensification.
Yeah, I was certainly, I didn't mean to say that it necessitates that. What I was saying is that that's one of the responses that people have. And I count that as a technological fix, which avoids the sort of issues that you're talking about. I mean, I was talking to somebody in coffee about the fact that the contraception is the elephant in the room. You know, I mean, that's, you know, it's something that Christians often don't talk about. But as Sean McDonough says, you either control population in the world in a humane way, or you allow it to be controlled in the natural way, which of course is violent, either through warfare or through starvation. Something else that of course, I mean, it wasn't within the remit here, but of course, you know, we talk about intensification of farming. Well, you wouldn't need that intensification if people in the richer nations stopped eating meat. You know, there are lots of issues like that. I mean, and to think, and I started off at the beginning by saying I think the major problem is that we all get this incessant feed of sound bites from the media, and we don't actually recognise that all of these things are very complex. There isn't a simple solution, which is why I ended in the way that I did. I think that actually what we need to do as Christians is a lot more prayer about actually saying, what does God actually want from us? If God gives us this ability, if we have this God-given wisdom, how do we use it? Well, we need the wisdom of God to understand how to use the wisdom that God has given us.
Two lined up here.
David Ursel, thank you. It must be marvellous being a theologian, because you don't actually have to come down either side. We were told to say whether it was a question or a statement. Mine's a statement. I'm an organic farmer and a Christian, and therefore struggled with these issues. And can I just say we're at the position that I've come to, which is the precautionary position. So we look back and we see asbestos and we say, wonderful, waterproof, fireproof, let's go for it. We went for it for 35 years and then discovered it kills. We were presented as organic farmers with this wonderful feed, which was cheap protein, i.e. dead cheap. We fed it to our cattle. If you weren't organic, you fed it to your cattle, and then your cattle got BSE, etc. And so what I would like to say is that we're made in the image of a creative God, and we can't stop being creative, but we must have a precautionary principle. And I would say that has to be the case with GM. So let's see what they can do, but we must let it out. Let's keep it in the lab, in the greenhouse. Once we let it out, we can never get it back.
And that's precisely what I was saying. I'll pick up on the sort of not answering, but is that it's those two aspects of wisdom. You know, that we actually recognise the wisdom to do the experimentation, but we need the other wisdom that actually says, but hang on a minute. And I think the precautionary side. My remit was not to give an answer. And one of the things that my students constantly would ask me is, but what's the answer? And I said, well, actually, I'm not sure that there is a definitive answer. There are answers. And so I want to offer to you an opportunity to carry on the conversation.
It's all right, until when you get in the real world.
Well, yes,
We don't have to follow up.
but I have to prepare students to actually be in the real world and to, how do they think about the question that is being asked. If I told them what the answer was, they could either say I agree or I disagree. They wouldn't actually then think and question. So I'm being too defensive.
Susan Atkinson, another farmer. It's only recently that the DNA scientists told us that 80% of the human genome, which are considered junk, actually has a point. It was 2010 before they mapped the wheat genome. Happens to be 5 times larger than ours. This GM has been going around with stuff they didn't know what they're talking about. And it is. Because, of course, the greatest desire of the human heart is to be as God. And that is the problem. Because in the West, Nathan, I wish there were more Africans here today, because you were talking from a totally different perspective. Because in the West, the majority of people are totally divorced from creation. And consequently, there's no sense of the miraculous. Because the truth is, we don't know how the food we eat, we manage to eat without killing ourselves. It all has poisonous relatives. We don't know how we got to these strains that don't kill us. Without our kidneys, they kill us anyway. And we are messing around for stuff we don't know. And it's okay, we have the talk that we want to feed the world. Well, if we wanted to feed the world, hunger would have been solved decades ago. Because there is more than enough. What there isn't is the will to do so.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I was going to say, the way you started is of course absolutely right. And that's why I sort of said that we're created to have a relationship with God, a relationship with each other, and a relationship with creation. And of course it's when we started to play God, as we see in the picture of Genesis 3, when we wanted the control and the power, all 3 of those relationships are broken. And that's why I think that what's so important here is that we get our relationship with God.
Well done, that's the process.
Andrew, right. You comment to the last question there about the difference between, or the two sides of common sense wisdom and God's wisdom, and the need to pause to think. Genetic manipulation was the first subject in which science did stop and think. The famous Paul Bird letter, which is now largely overlooked, said, we don't know what this is. It looks good. Let's stop and think. And as a result, world governments did stop and think and put in place at least some restraint. In fact, it went down to, if I remember rightly, local communities in Boston set up their own local regulation on GM long before the American government did. So it is one example where science has led to a reflection. It might not for all scientists be God's wisdom, but at least the wider issues away from science, which didn't happen with, for example, nuclear energy.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Hello, Trevor Meakin, my fellow geologist. That helps. Just to say that John Innes has obviously done a huge amount of achievements in the last 20 odd years. Do you think the Gates Foundation's altruism is a good thing? And do you think it's wise?
Well, I think I'd have to know a lot more about it. I mean, all I know is what I've actually seen in Norwich and what I've read on the Guardian and BBC websites. And I think that if somebody wants to fund the possibility of improving the life of resource-poor farmers in the developing world, then we've got to look at it. But I think that your point about always sort of the precautionary line is important, but it sounds something worth investigating, and if these folk are prepared to put that sort of money into it happening. So, and of course the money is put in so that it will not then cost people to whom the technology is passed on. And that's the problem when you're dealing with companies that have shareholders who require a share of the profits. So you're looking at Monsanto or Bayer, and of course you've got a different picture there, because they actually have to cover the costs of their R&D.
One final question.
I thank you for pointing out our creativity, God-given creativity, which spills into this general thing. But how can we then use it without, boosting our pride, but rather use it out of love? Not only for God, like you said, and humanity, but not boosting our pride and saying, oh, our creativity is for helping the poor. Rather, actually, our creativity is for the love of what God has placed in our midst. How can we balance that?
I mean, for the individual, that is down to the individual's own relationship with God, or whatever whatever their values and beliefs are. But I think that for us as a Christian church, for example, we ought to be looking at motives, and asking about motives. We ought to be looking at issues of justice. And these are the sort of issues that we should be looking at. And that's where I think the Catholic Church is helpful in one sense, in which it sort of says, we mustn't think that somehow creation can't be changed. It's given to humanity to take care of, to steward, in the best understanding of the word steward. But we still have to work out what is good and what is bad. I think the whole business of risks management and actually having to ask the questions and about the precautionary stance, it's a very important place to begin from. But the hard point comes is, do we stop doing something that can actually help people? It's a huge question when it comes to human genetic engineering, particularly in the whole area of the production of children. It's a huge, that if you can solve somebody's heartache, is that actually something you ought to do?
Yeah, but the challenge is that we are trying to help people, we are trying to find out what they need, not what we need.
Yes.
So we need to look perhaps in the mirror and say, what do I actually need as a person, not what do I want to give them. Perhaps a change of heart from within ourselves and say, hang on, we must do so much consumerism that is actually boosting us.
Oh yeah.
I
agree.
Well, thank you very much, John. I think there's a huge sort of complexity of issues. Thank you very, very much indeed.